Okay,
We're both.
there we
we're
go.
both.
Okay, now you're on.
Thank you, Scott. Perfect. So yeah, we always talk with a little bit of introduction, and I usually sort of draw just on what's in the air at Seeking Integrity at the Treatment Center in LA, and in my own clients and my own life sometimes. And this last couple of days, we've been talking a lot about empathy, and it just reminded me that maybe we hadn't talked about empathy in a while, and it's like a vital aspect of recovery, and it's something that is a casualty in a lot of addictive disorders. And I was mentioning to clients today, I don't think I've ever mentioned here, was a really fascinating study at NYU, New York University, of meth users, and they showed them faces of the same guy making a happy face and a sad face and an angry face and a frowny face, and they asked the meth users to, okay, what is the emotion that you're seeing on this guy's face? And they couldn't identify it. Their empathy circuits were literally so disrupted that they were unable to say, oh, that's a happy face. What they did instead, by the way, there was a lot of paranoia with methamphetamine that say, boy, that's an evil grin that guy has. So it was all kind of misinterpreted and misreading social cues. And that's really the most dramatic example of it, but we see the same kind of detachment in sex and porn addiction as well. So when we get this combination of amphetamines or even just sex and porn addiction on their own, we see this gradual disconnection. And it's not just being bad people. There's a lot of brain stuff going on here that actually disconnects our ability to read other people and to feel what they're feeling. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what empathy is, how addiction affects it, and most of all, how we can kind of get it back, because that's really what most people are interested in. So to start at the beginning, empathy is literally the ability to experience what other people are feeling. If my friend Scott here is in some kind of emotional pain, I can talk to him and look at him, and I can feel that pain. I can sense what he's going through, and it's a real human connection. And it's allowed us to really survive as a species, because it allows us to connect with each other in very meaningful ways and cooperate and collaborate. So that's literally what that means: the ability to feel what someone else is feeling. And what happens with addiction? Well, I'll take a step back. How does this work? We know that empathy is, in the last 10 years or so, we found these, what they're calling the empathy circuitry in the brain. There's now, I think, 11 spots in the brain that they've connected with these mirror neurons we've talked about before here, that really allow us to achieve this ability to interpret what other people are feeling. But I think with addiction, not only is that kind of a brain issue, but we kind of close up, we get so sort of wrapped up in our own selves in a very narcissistic way that we start to disconnect from other people, including people that we care a lot about. And so that's really one of the casualties. And of course, every partner is very aware of how that feels and what that disconnection looks like in their own lives. So empathy really isn't kindness or pity or anything. I think it's a real human connection with somebody else. And so basically, we learn empathy, we're primed for it in the first 2 years of life, when we have good, healthy attachment, what's called attachment, connections to other people. And that really teaches us, actually teaches our brains how to be able to identify with other people and connect with other people. So it's an early thing that humans get. We all have the capacity, but it's an incredibly important part for social cooperation. And as I say, it's one of the casualties of addiction. We see people doing incredibly selfish and hurtful things to people they love or say they love, right? And they do at some level, but there's this disconnect. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is healing empathy, how it comes back. So there's some habits there's been a lot of research actually on what it is and how do we get it. So there's an interesting study on the habits of highly empathetic people. And there's 4 of them they identified. The first is that they cultivate curiosity about strangers. There's a natural curiosity about engaging with somebody, and not with judgment or an agenda, but just kind of curious, like, who is that guy? What's his story? Or what is she doing? And why does she look upset, or why does she look happy? And just kind of engaging with people at that emotional level, that emotional curiosity that just enables us, really, it's a stance of openness that allows us to connect with other people. The second one is that we have to really challenge any prejudices or separateness. We had a conversation on the unit earlier this week about going into a 12-step meeting and how important it is to identify rather than compare. Because especially I think in the sex addiction meetings, there's so many different behaviors that it's very easy for somebody to walk in and say, well, I never did that, or I sure never did that, and I'm not as bad as that guy. And suddenly we're separate. And I think it's a really important stance to be able to kind of see, well, what do I have in common with that person? We may look different, we have done different things in our addiction, but what is it that we have in common? And I think if we can have that attitude, that's the beginning of empathy right there, is that we can start to look for the commonalities, the connections that we have with other people. And then you can take it even further. And goes back to the habits of empathetic people. They actually kind of, in their mind, they kind of try on the other person's life. Well, what must it be like to be in that guy's shoes? What's going on with him? What's his story? And how does it feel? And how must that feel? And this is, by the way, an important part of couples recovery. A lot of dialogue, imago dialogue, particularly in couples counseling, will look at this empathetic response. Like, gee, I can imagine, I can see how you would feel that way. Or I can understand how you would feel. And in the beginning, it's very difficult to do that, I think, to actually have that feeling. But that's something that we have to consciously practice, and it gets better. It's one of those things that does get better with practice the more we do it. So kind of try on another person's life, like put yourself in their shoes and see what it must be like. And then the fourth thing, and this is really critical, is really being a good listener. We have to really listen, because so much of the time our heads are full of our stories and our chatter and our distractions and our agenda. And if we're in active addiction, we have our secrets, and we're like, what don't we want to say, and what do we want to hide and cover and deflect? And so there's a lot of white noise interfering with the true connection with the other person. And so if we can really become a good listener, and by the way, in therapy, we talk about something called active listening, which is where you're really engaged. You're not trying to fix, you're not trying to even reply so much, but you're just engaged, because many times people don't want a solution. They don't want to be fixed. They just want to be heard. And I think that's really a critical skill, because we oftentimes, and it's well intended, but we kind of jump in, want to jump in and fix it, or worse, we hijack the connection and make it, well, let me tell you about the time that happened to me. And suddenly it's all about me and not the person that's talking. So just really, these are simple things to do, but they're very effective in terms of fostering that attitude. That's the kind of the external piece. The internal piece is really starting to become aware of feelings and thoughts and the differences between them, by the way, and what's going on with that, to really start to get an internal read. And this is another area where the addict has a lot of damage from the addiction, because the ability to connect to those internal feelings really gets disrupted. We don't know. When a client comes into Seeking Integrity, we hand them a notebook. We have a couple of different ways that there's big feelings wheels and feelings chart and emojis, and because people have a hard time expressing or even identifying what they're feeling. Usually they're just feeling kind of lousy or shame. But there's a whole range, of course, like a whole vocabulary of other feelings. So really starting to learn how to get in touch with those. And as I said, to distinguish between thoughts and feelings. So very oftentimes, somebody will say, well, how do you feel about, how things are going? And literally the language will be, well, I think it's going good. But again, it's a thought, not a feeling. So just even paying close attention to language and really focusing on the feel. Well, I feel sad that we're at this point, or I feel excited that we've gone this far, or whatever the feeling is. But just notice the distinguishing factors between thoughts and feelings, which is another one. So learning to identify our own feelings, and also really to experience major differences. I think one of the beauties of waking up, I think in recovery, at least in my own life, was realizing there's a whole bunch of people out there, and we're all different. And I think the more we kind of embrace the uniqueness of different people and learn from their experience, the broader our own experience gets, the broader our ability, and the deeper our empathy gets. I think I got sober in New York City, and it was just incredibly ethnic rooms where I got sober, and it was very important for me because I was kind of stuck in my own bubble, and I really needed to see other people and to hear their experience and to hear their lives, and to people that had different color of skin than I did, or different backgrounds than I did. And by the way, I tell this story. I thought I I'm an alcoholic in recovery. I thought I was an Upper East Side kind of drunk. I didn't live there, but I thought those are the people I could identify with. And I never could get sober. I finally got sober in a really what we called a low bottom meeting with a lot of people at that time in New York State. All the asylums had opened up, so there were a lot of people with mental illness and a lot of homelessness, and that's where I got sober. I realized that's where I was. I think I couldn't see it inside my addiction, but so that embracing that diversity is really important. And by the way, I think if we can really embrace that empathy and connect with other people, in my own case, in that example, it just reflected back on me so much. I learned so much more about me. So this is a skill. I think it's a really frustrating for partners, especially because that empathy does disappear. It is a casualty of the addiction, but it can come back. But it takes some conscious effort and practice and kind of knowing what you're doing. And I think therapists can help with that. But it's something that I think we should have to practice, and it gets better. And it really does get better. So I think with that, I'll stop. Thanks, Scott.
There we go. Thank you, David. If you have questions, type them into the Q&A feature. I've actually got a couple questions. I just kind of scribbled them down at various points. Men versus women on empathy. I have heard that women are naturally wired for empathy in a way that men are not. Is that true? Is that a neurobiological thing, or are women just acculturated that way? So I think women are generally better at empathy than men, just in general.
Right, and that's something we don't really understand yet, Scott. There's brain science, and we just know so little about the brain. But what we're discovering, as I mentioned, we have this empathy circuitry, which males and females have. But we do know that females tend to be more relational in their relationships, not only with partners, but with friends and colleagues. They're much more engaged. Men are less relational, more visual. And I think a lot of that goes back toward survival in the savannah, when men kind of watch the horizon for danger, and women related and we're caretakers, honestly. And so I think, thank God we don't have to be trapped in that anymore as men or women. But I think in general, women do tend to be more relational. But that doesn't mean that, and that's not an excuse for men to be a cop out here, because men can be incredibly empathetic, and they just need to practice it and learn it. I think we're fighting a couple of things. We're fighting a little bit of biology, and we're fighting a lot of culture. And I think men are not socialized so much to be empathetic. In fact, it's getting better now, but I think we do a terrible job with raising boys in this country. But I think being empathetic is not something that's prized in a lot of men. And so I think that's a shame. And I think hopefully that's something that is changing. And I see it where there's good, healthy recovery, I see a lot of empathy.
Yeah, and the example I use with guys when I'm teaching about empathy in the sex addiction work group or the porn addiction work group is we tend to be really good with physical pain, feeling others' physical pain. Like if you're in a softball game and the pitcher takes a line drive to the groin, every single male in the place immediately grabs his own groin and goes, oh.
Right. The mirror neurons are highly engaged at that point. Yeah.
We're good with physical pain. It's the emotional pain that whether we're not quite as wired because less connection between the two brain hemispheres, or acculturated, is that the right word? I don't know, but we're taught not to be empathetic, I think.
Right. Right.
So one more question, and then we'll get to the Q&A feature. Addicts, notoriously not empathetic, which you covered. Do we not develop it in the early years of life and therefore not have it? I know we still have the capacity, we still have mirror neurons, but we just don't develop that skill. Or does addiction shut it down? Or is it a combination? Or, do we know?
Great question. To the extent that we know or understand this, there's a couple of things going on. Everybody has basically the same brain parts that allow them to have empathy from a functional point of view. But I think, remember I said the first 2 years of life, when the attachment issues, if there's a disruption there, or if in really the first 6 or 7 years of life, especially if there's what we call adverse childhood experiences, where there's abuse and then physical abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, or even chronic bullying, anything that's kind of disruptive that makes that child kind of go internal and disconnect a little bit for safety. that interferes. And you see right there the beginnings of damaged empathy. Because if I'm in a dangerous situation as I don't know, a child of a violent alcoholic or something, what I do is I go inward, right? I close down and shut down, because it's dangerous to be too exposed and too connected. And so I think it's a survival technique that's learned early on. But the problem with that is that happens so early in life that as adults, we've never really had. And by the way, that history often leads to addiction. So fast forward, you have an addict who had that experience in childhood, never learned empathy, although all the mechanics are there. And so it's a matter of really learning it sometimes for the first time. But even to the extent that we do have it, addiction is very damaging to it. And especially the amphetamines and sex and porn, because the intensity of those, more than even other addictions, are especially damaging to empathy.
Yeah, I mean, there's just more, the grooves in the brain are deeper with these intensity addictions like meth and cocaine and sex and porn.
Exactly, right.
And it's just harder to get out of that neurochemical rut. Okay, let's jump to the Q&A. If the sex addict also has serious anger issues, should he see a CSAT or an anger management therapist? And I will add, or both.
Right. So these are both things that need to be addressed. And depending on the situation and the case, I guess, there are many CSATs who do anger management. It's not that they're totally separate skill sets. Although I've had cases where there was a primary CSAT as a primary therapist, and then they would refer out to like an anger management group. The best, in my opinion, the best practices for anger management is a group setting. And so that makes perfect sense to me. If I'm working with someone individually, we can talk about the issues, the underlying issues, maybe the trauma or the emotional pain that maybe caused the anger, but the skills to deal with the anger are best served in an anger management group, because you have the power of the other guys, or women, by the way. And they should be separate, men's groups, women's groups. There's far more men's anger groups, but a group setting really does help, because those are skills and that can be practiced, and it often takes confrontation from other men to hear it, and you can go much faster. You could do that. I could do the same things in the context of an individual therapy session, not one, but over time, but it's just much faster in a group setting. So I would recommend both, frankly. Now, if we always have to kind of triage issues, right? And so if somebody has this really, really bad, like intermittent explosive disorder, we call it, where they just kind of lose control and rage or hit or lash out, that's probably something I'd want to address first, as opposed to the CSAT issues, because those things really are going to interfere with the person's ability to really move smoothly into recovery. And also, by the way,
it might be different with like alcohol. Like I get rageful when I'm drunk, so maybe we should address the drinking and then the rage.
No, exactly. But we've had clients who are not drug users, who are sex addicts and porn addicts, who would have this explosive, behavior. And so we have to look at what's going on there. And I also, by the way, probably get a psychiatric consult, just because there might be some impulse control disorders or obsessive. There's other kinds of issues that might be helped with medication. But so it really, you have to take each case kind of on an individual basis. But those are two different therapeutic modalities, the addiction and the anger management, and how you combine them or not depends on the case, I would say.
They're both behavioral issues, though, and the techniques are going to be like CBT and DBT. They're going to be behavioral therapies, right? But
exactly.
Different settings. And by the way, addicts also, and David has mentioned this 1,000 times, also recover best in a group setting. It's just different topics in the group setting.
Right. Yeah.
Is anger linked to, like, those of us with intensity addictions, do we also often have anger issues, which is another intensity issue?
Great question. And yeah, we see that very often. And intensity addictions, really what we're talking about are really the high rate of dopamine that's put out by the addictive behavior, whether it's an amphetamine drug or sex or porn or gambling or even excess work sometimes, some sort of financial stuff. all the high intensity sports, some kind of gaming with competition, all of those really rev up the system. And so
there's dopamine or adrenaline that we're dealing with, or both?
Both actually.
Okay.
On that intensity side, those are the two primary. It's really basically what we're talking about with intensity addictions. It's a fight or flight response. It's fight or flight, and it's literally that. Your pupils get big and everything kind of goes into like life or death scenario. And so as you can see, it's very easy then to slip over in anger and lose control of that. Plus there's irritability. One of the main hallmarks of withdrawal from sex or porn addiction is irritability and anger. And so you get a guy trying to, not use porn, or maybe there's been a discovery and he's trying to keep his act together, but he's not really getting the help he needs. There's going to be anger. There's going to be explosion. There's going to be blaming, because that's what happens with that energy unless it's directed more properly into recovery.
And the coping mechanism has been the addiction. When I'm feeling this anger, I don't want to feel it, so I go look at porn for a while. Now I don't have the coping mechanism. Anger.
Exactly. Yeah.
Next one here. Hello, Dr. Fawcett. I agree that finding commonality within a group is important. Even today, after 6 months, I still find this challenging. I always have thoughts that I am not as bad as the other guy, or I haven't reached my bottom yet, or if this is my peer group, that I am such a bad person. That makes me laugh because I've had those thoughts. My question is, how do I tame my evil, rational mind?
It's a really great question.
Yes.
Because I think it's so typical, especially in early recovery. We walk in, we're not sure we belong here. We, like everybody else in our society, has a concept of what a sex addict looks like or is like and what that means. And there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of denial. And so, yeah, that's a really common phenomenon. I think basically when I see, when I read because I'm not as bad as the other guy, and sometimes there's a flavor of shame in these things, right? We're feeling a lot of shame about being there. And one of those defenses against shame is to start comparing. Okay, well, I've done some bad things, but boy, I haven't done that, or I haven't done that. And it's sort of easy to set ourselves apart. That's a dangerous, dangerous strategy, because suddenly we're unique and separate and not as bad. And that's kind of a permission slip to go off and have trouble. So I would really just encourage you to just stick it out. Stay in the meeting, sit with your discomfort. And I think this is another thing we're not very good at, is sitting with uncomfortable feelings or thoughts. And so, or sitting in general, intensity addicts also have a hard time sitting still, right? Boredom, even relaxation, downtime, a 2-hour block in your calendar that has nothing filled in. All those things can be really relapse triggers because we don't sit still very well. And so, but I really encourage you to push through that and sit in the meeting and really start to identify. And in the beginning, I had to really consciously practice in a kind of meditative way. When somebody was sharing, it was a little mental game I would play to, okay, what do I hear in this person's share that I also feel or have done? I may look different and have done different things and have a different life experience, but boy, there's a lot of commonality. And I think if we really can make that as kind of a meditative focus when we're in a meeting, really listening, there's that listening piece again, I think it does start to come through. But what I read in your question with all those different examples, and they're really great because they're so true, right? They're really true for a lot of people, is that to me, that's the addiction kind of fighting, wanting your attention. There's a little bit of a struggle, a power struggle going on with recovery and addiction there. And so just give recovery a chance and just sit there and really take what you can get. And by the way, and Scott, this may be your experience too, is that, not every meeting is a great meeting. Not everybody says pearls of wisdom. There are people I find annoying. There are meetings I just won't go to after a while because they're just not well run. But for the most part, on the average of the thousands of meetings I've been to, I take what I want and leave the rest. That's a slogan in AA, and it really works.
Yeah, and I've sat through so-called bad meetings, but I listen for the one nugget that I showed up for if I'm there and I'm kind of stuck there. And somebody inevitably will say something and be like, oh, that's why I can't.
Yes.
which is kind of amazing. I have been in meetings where the person on my left has had 3,000 sex partners, and the person on my right has had one sex partner, and porn. And it's still a sex addiction meeting. And, they may look at each other and say, my disease is nothing like yours, and your disease is nothing like mine. But then when we start looking at, underlying issues like childhood trauma, and we start looking at shame, and we start looking at the feelings that trigger us to act out, suddenly they go, oh, we're exactly the same. It manifests differently, but we're exactly the same. So yeah, if you're in a meeting and you're struggling to identify with this guy's done way worse than me, or I've done way worse than, or, he's had 8,000 sex partners and, I only had a couple of affairs, forget that stuff and start paying attention to the feelings and the childhoods and the faulty perception that addicts have. We have this faulty perception of the world. And we think we're put upon all the time and that nobody loves us and nobody will ever meet our needs. And that's a faulty perception. Start paying attention to that and you can start to connect with other people really easily.
And I just want to, since we're on this topic of like how we sit in a meeting and listen, I want to bring it back to empathy, and because that really, when the goal of repairing and healing a lot of relationships that have been damaged by the addiction is to really build that intimacy, right? And this empathy in meetings, and we talk about, we're quite conscious of this with our clients at Seeking Integrity when they're sitting together in group. That's the beginning of intimacy, because intimacy is starting to trust other people, it's listening, and it's being vulnerable. It's starting to share what's on your mind, what you're feeling. And those are the beginnings. And very often that happens in recovery meetings. And very often then that can translate back home to the relationship. That those empathy skills that we're talking about, those green shoots, often occur in the context of a 12-step meeting. And that's where it gets translated.
I absolutely learned empathy in 12-step meetings.
Yeah.
I saw other people experiencing empathy, and then one day I realized, oh, I'm experiencing, somebody was telling something that was really good that had happened, and they were so, and I was elated for that person. I thought, oh my God, that's empathy. Oh my God. After several years of waiting for empathy, I realized suddenly, or having to practice empathy. It was just happening, it was a nice moment. I like this next question. Hi, Dr. Fawcett. They say you are the average of the 5 people you surround yourself with. So if I surround myself with worse addicts than me, isn't that bad for me? And I'm just going to say, yes, I drank and drugged and sexed my way right down the ladder, and, looking for lower companions. So, okay, the question here is, can addicts become better if they attend chemsex? Can a porn addict become better if he attends chemsex groups? Or will he become worse and become a chemsex addict? Interesting question, and I'm interested to hear your response, and I certainly have a response too.
I think there's always the danger, what Scott talked about, of kind of learning new bad behaviors and saying, wow, I never tried that. That sounds intriguing. But I think on the whole, we can get stuff from any meeting. I'm an alcoholic. I'm not an amphetamine user. But my home group here is a Crystal Meth Anonymous meeting because I like the quality of the shares and the connection of the people that attend it. And so I'm one of those people that kind of floats between different fellowships and finds a lot of recovery and a lot of gifts in any meeting I happen to go to. I think, at least in the beginning, if you're a porn addict, you probably want to stick closer to the porn meetings, although I think you could get something out of the sex addiction meetings as well. It certainly wouldn't hurt, but I think maybe to find people that you really relate to. The other thing too, by the way, depending on where you're at with your recovery, and just to pick up on what Scott had said, when people, and we try to control meetings, right? So that they're not really graphic language and not really triggering language, but when people describe what they've done, there's an element of comparing, right? It's like, oh my God, I never thought of that, or I never tried that, or I wish I would have, suddenly we're down that road back into fantasy about what might be. And so I'd be cautious about that. If you choose to go to a meeting there where it's not particularly your targeted fellowship, I would sure talk about it and share about it and see, and just share your experience. I wouldn't go in and out on your own without talking about it. But I think in the beginning of this, I'd stick closer to your own fellowships. Scott, what do you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, in active addiction, yes, I was actively looking for lower companions because my addiction was pushing me to look for lower companions, and it was easy to find them. And eventually I got low enough and decided, okay, I'm done. Meetings are where we're looking for higher companions. Any 12-step meeting for me is a good 12-step meeting in a way, because people are there to recover from the addiction, whatever it is. Now there are certain meetings. There's a Meth Anonymous, CMA, Crystal Meth Anonymous. There's a CMA meeting here that is notorious for people picking up on each other and relapsing. I would not recommend anybody go to that meeting if you want to get sober from anything, because people in there are not getting sober. And I would certainly look for a meeting where it's going to be easier for you to identify. If you have a chemsex problem, yeah, you need to go to chemsex meetings. If you don't, you're probably better off at your porn meeting or your straight up sex addicts meetings. And this goes for everybody. If you're at a meeting and it does not feel safe, leave. There's another meeting somewhere and it will feel safe. Yeah. But some of my best friends are chemsex addicts. They're just 20 plus years sober and they have great sobriety. They're higher companions for me, particularly when I met them, because they had, more time than I did. So they were higher companions.
Right. Yeah, I think at some point the nature of the addictive behavior kind of becomes less relevant the farther you get into recovery. It's more the nature of the recovery, which is universal, really.
I have a friend who goes to Gamblers Anonymous. I've been to a few meetings with him. I gambled like twice in my life. Once I lost a bet in school, and once I put a quarter in a slot machine in Reno. Literally not my thing. But I identify with people in a GA meeting, and I can share, and they identify with me because I talk about, the underlying issues and feelings and, things like that. And that's universal for addicts.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, next one. Sorry. As far as comparison to other people who are recovering, you mentioned feeling better than. How about those of us who feel worse than? I'm continually embarrassed when I hear what to me are relatively or minor offenses from other people in recovery. It hurts. Maybe I'm just, okay, go, let's answer this one. This is our topic, it seems.
I had my first sponsor, I got sober in my 20s, and it was a low bottom for me, but it was certainly not as low as it could have gone. And my first sponsor made this analogy. It stuck with me all these years. And it's basically, he said, addiction, you're in an elevator and it's going down. And you can get off at the 20th floor or the 10th floor or the lobby or the sub basement. But what you have to know is that there's only one direction and it's going down. And so I think if you're lucky enough to get off at the 10th floor instead of the sub basement, great. The thing is that you have to understand what are the addictive characteristics that you have, where was that addiction leading you, and what do you need to do about it. So I think that's, everybody has that in common. We all, no matter what we've done, no matter what's happened to us, we have this direction of the addiction kind of pulling us down. I think, again, we talked a few minutes ago about shame. I think shame underlies a lot of these things. And so when we're kind of comparing and reflecting on our experience, or how we feel about our experience, more importantly, to what we hear from other people, it's the shame that I'm hearing being activated with you. And so I'd really sort of want to address the shame, because shame really does nobody any good. It just is a toxic emotion that kind of pulls us down without any kind of growth potential coming out of it. So I just think, yeah, there are people that are doing all kinds of things. And again, we don't want to compare, but I think as a general principle, just really try to relate without taking good, better than, or worse than, kind of keep those comparison words out of it and just relate. What does this person have that I can learn from? What's the common experience between the two of us? Remember we're talking tonight about empathy and how we're connected. And so I think, if anything, that person can be an object lesson, if nothing else. Like, my God, that's where I'm going to be if I don't stop. And I think that's an important piece too. I was scared to death when I first came out. I was scared to death of a lot of stuff, but there was a guy in my first meetings who was 20 years sober, and he was like one of the pillars of the rooms, and had all he always had the wise shares, and everything was brilliant. And in my 5th or 6th month, he relapsed, and it was such an eye opener for me, because I realized anybody can fall, and he'd been doing really well and seemed to be doing really well and strong, and was a model, and had 8,000 sponsees and all that stuff. But it was an eye opener for me, because I thought, man, this addiction is only going one direction, and at any moment it could happen to us if we don't do what we need to do. That could happen to me, and so I think just to really not compare it, not judge yourself, not live in the shame, but really. We talk here a lot about gratitude, but I think gratitude is a huge tool to kind of reverse that and say, well, you can be grateful that you're not in a place that some other people had to go before they were able to get sober. I think you can kind of reframe it in a way that might serve you better.
Yeah. And, I think about some of the meetings I've been to. There was a meeting I used to go to, and it was I called it the one-up meeting. Somebody would share like how great they were and where they played golf, and the next person would have played golf at a better resort, and the next person would just bought a new golf cart, and it was in a swanky part of the desert here. And I stopped going to that meeting because I was like, nobody's talking about recovery or even addiction here. And then there's another meeting that I have been to a few times, and I call it the one down meeting. It's just a bunch of people who well, I'm the worst person. No, I'm the worst person. No, and they're all living in the problem and not the solution. And I don't like meetings where it's all how wonderful I am, or it's all how awful I am. I want to know that I'm an addict just like you, and here's what I do about it that works. Or here's what I did that didn't work, and I wish I'd done something different. That's what I look for in a meeting. And this comparing, it just doesn't do us any good, I don't think.
Right, I totally agree. Right, and those meetings are just so unhealthy. Our friend and colleague Karen talks about junkie pride, and where people kind of, and I see that like, well, I smoke meth. Well, I injected meth. And when I got sober as the heroin users had like they were the top of the heap or the bottom of the, I'm not sure, whatever frame you want to put on it, but it doesn't do any good. We're comparing how awful we were. And that's a bad attitude to have.
And it keeps us separate instead of bringing us together. And the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. When we feel connected, we don't have the need to go back to our addiction. I mean, that's the short version. Maybe go ahead, Dave.
I just want to. I don't know if you're going to cover this next one or not about judging. I just want to comment on that. Just because sometimes we do see different addictions being kind of on this hierarchy of bad, and at least I'm not like them. I just want to say, to speak up for my chemsex users, because there's a lot of stigma about that. And I've had a lot of guys who were, falling down, alcoholics, who were drunk, talking about, well, God, those guys that use meth, how could they do that to themselves? As the guy's puking and falling off his bar stool. Just it's the same. It's addiction, and I think we need to really take the comparison out of it, take the judgment out of it. People find different drugs and different behaviors appealing for different reasons, and there's sometimes no logic to it. But I think certainly there's no value in judging it. Again, empathy. We need to identify what's going on with that person, and if anything, try to have compassion. I haven't used that word tonight, but really that's a very close cousin of empathy, right? Is compassion, feeling something for that person, and understanding a little bit about where they've come from.
Okay, so empathy is so surely is expressed through both the words and a person's presence. But wouldn't you agree that there is something about the energy? I find empathy so rare that it often brings me to tears when someone has this certain presence and energy or feeling of openness along with the words. We can feel it, i.e. empathy, and it's so healing and wonderful. What in the world can a partner or friend say to their friend that they need empathy from, but that person doesn't know how to give it or settle into it? So, when I need empathy or you need empathy, what can I, but the other person can't respond or I can't respond. What do we do? You need empathy for me and I'm just a stone wall. What do we do?
Yeah. I really like the idea about energy here, because that's a notion that a lot of people aren't really tuned into. But I study energy very carefully, and yeah, there is something about this like wall of heart energy, I call it, that connects someone. I think when you're really needing the empathy and the other person's not capable of giving it, I think that's a really tough situation. I think patience, for one thing. It depends on where the other person's at, in my mind. If the other person is in active addiction or just not even trying, or clueless, or unaware or unconscious, then I think you probably need to find other people who can provide that for you. And that's if that person is your marital partner, that's a very painful place to be, obviously, if that person can't relate. Now, I do think with some effort and some therapy and some practice, as we've talked about tonight, that those empathy skills can kind of reawaken and start to emerge. But I think sometimes the person who's struggling to get in touch with their own ability for empathy doesn't know how to do it. That's why I kind of laid out tonight some kind of practical steps and attitudes, because it's just, we don't know, okay, now what, And so I think just having an easy, calming presence. I think sometimes when I'm working with clients, and this may or may not work for you, but it's useful sometimes, I think, to go nonverbal, and to really, we were talking about energy in this question. I would maybe hold somebody's hand, and there's something called eye gazing, where you look, especially in the other person's left eye, for whatever reason, and really steady eye gaze for 30 seconds, which is incredibly intense and hard to do sometimes. But it also is kind of a nonverbal way of starting to establish that connection, because our bodies feel empathy, not just through words, right? They feel it through the energy you're talking about. It can be touch. It can be a hand on the shoulder. It can be a hand on the knee. It can be kind words. It doesn't have to be kind of full-blown empathy. There's ways of suggesting that, and I think that opens the door to more full-blown ways of expressing it. But I think those kind of nonverbal ways of just connecting. Scott used that word a minute ago, and it's so important. Empathy is about connection, and if we can't practice empathy with a master skill, we can certainly start to connect. And I think that's one of the essential building blocks to build empathy, is establishing that connection. And it may be just sitting there holding hands. It may be sitting there sharing. It may be sitting there in silence, or it may be doing something together. I think it's really healing for couples to not just have these really difficult talks sometimes, and I do believe those are essential, those daily check-ins and other kinds of communication verbally, but also doing things. Go out, take a walk, do a bike ride, do something fun. Those also start to create those connections that enable the empathy to flourish down the road. So I think it's all about the connection, and we can practice that in many different ways.
Just kind of speaking from the other side of this, as the person who did not have empathy for a very, very, very long time, one of my biggest regrets is that when people reached out to me needing empathy, I just closed up and didn't provide it. And I can think of 2 or 3 instances. One of them, I was in my early 20s, and one of my friends told me about some sexual abuse that he had suffered as a child, and I couldn't handle it. I mean, my response was, wow, that sucks, let's get drunk. It was not helpful. and I regret that. I would love to go back and relive that moment with some empathy. And I think most addicts have regrets like that later down the line. It's not stuff we're usually focused on more immediate things that we've screwed up in early recovery, but down the line, sometimes we remember this stuff and think, oh my God, that person really needed me. And I was just not there.
Right. And that's such a great example of how an addict can get so wrapped up, not only in their own stuff, but how disconnected from those kind of the human ability for connection, right? And emotion too. Emotions are disconnected. So yeah, that's a perfect example.
Yeah. And this was someone I genuinely cared about at the time. Okay, my husband grew up in a family that had a very poor understanding of boundaries. So that's what he's learned, and he has a hard time with it. How does the lack of boundaries fit into the development of sex addiction and the recovery process? So lack of boundaries, how does it fit into and facilitate addiction? And how does it fit into and facilitate recovery?
Right. So boundaries, of course, are a key concept that we need in recovery. Boundaries, of course, keep us safe, right? And they're not meant to keep other people out, but to keep us safe and within our limits. And we have a right to have those. Even a marital couple has a right to have those. We always carefully assess the spouse's boundary needs before somebody goes home from seeking integrity, for example. But I think that lack of boundaries in the developmental process of addiction is really prominent. Very often families don't have poor boundaries. There's a lot of what we call enmeshment, where a son, for example, in the family might become kind of the confidant of the mother, and there's this kind of lopsided disconnect, or a parent may share private sexual things about the other parent with a child. That kind of stuff is just things that children aren't meant to handle or hear. And so I think that really sets the stage for poor boundaries as the addiction flourishes. I think lack of boundaries by itself probably doesn't account for the development of addiction, but it sure contributes to it. But I think what's happening, if you have a home where those poor boundaries are taking place, there's probably other factors as well that are at play that do impact the development of addiction. Those what we call adverse childhood experiences, whether it's neglect or different kinds of abuse or any kind of dysfunction or irregularity can tilt the balance enough to really allow addiction to flourish. And so boundaries are kind of symptomatic of it. I think they're part of the formula that create addiction. They're not the sole formula, but I think they're certainly a big part of it. Now in recovery, somebody that has that experience as a child is going to have a really hard time learning how to do it, because what happens when we learn proper boundaries as kids, it becomes innate. It becomes ingrained. So we just kind of have a sense of those boundaries and right and wrong. And when we start to come up against them, we kind of feel it, right? But somebody who hasn't had those boundaries has a hard time kind of knowing where to start and stop, and what to say and what not to say. And I believe those things have to be learned. They can be learned, but it's a weird thing where you have to learn by kind of experience, because you don't have a natural feeling of where the edge is. And so I think you learn that from experience and by good intentions, and by I've talked before about the power of a group. I think group is really important for that particular process, because you're learning, you're getting feedback. The group is a mirror basically for the person. And so I think all those things can be learned, and it's essential that they are learned. But it can be a struggle, because those boundaries in that situation where they weren't learned as kids never quite feel normal, I think, for quite a while. Eventually, I think they probably do with a lot of practice, but it's always, I had a friend, he used to describe, he had a situation similar to when you describe kind of lack of boundaries as a kid and lack of boundaries as an adult in his addiction, but he would just he would say he compared kind of his life to a dashboard of a car, and like his meter for boundaries. He had no natural sense of what was right and wrong, except for the crudest kind of form. So I think, he would say stuff inappropriately to different people and things like that. And so based on experience, he was a smart guy. He finally learned but I think it's something that does have to be learned, and it's a struggle as an adult. I won't say it's not.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with boundaries aren't necessarily a form of abuse, but boy, they open the door to abuse and neglect and inconsistency and all kinds of other things that do lead directly to addiction.
Yeah.
And boundaries are one of the things that most addicts have to learn in early recovery. I would say almost every addict needs to learn at least something about healthy boundaries in early recovery, because I didn't know where I ended and you began. I wanted to control me. I wanted to control you. I wanted to control 3 people past you. That was my boundary, was I'm in charge always of everything, including what you think and say. And if you don't do it right, I'm going to be pissed. And that's not a healthy boundary, and and then I would push you away, which is not a healthy boundary. David said it's not about keeping you out, it's about letting you in safely.
Right.
And and you letting me in safely. So they boundaries protect you from me as much as they protect me from you.
In our work groups, do you cover boundaries, or are there techniques that you use in those work groups to talk about that?
I think it's the level 3 sex addiction. We talk about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, we do talk about boundaries. Great topic. Okay. My husband attends Sex and Porn Addicts Anonymous and is told there is a shortage of sponsors. He desperately needs a sponsor. How does he get one when he already struggles to reach out? That's a great question.
Yeah, I don't know about the shortage in that fellowship, but I do know that that does occur sometimes. And my feeling about a sponsor, first of all, I think sponsors are incredibly important. I have seen people trying to find the perfect sponsor, and so they'll go weeks or months without one, looking for the perfect one. And my feeling is that a temporary sponsor is really important. If you can't find a permanent one, and the permanent one's not a marriage, if it doesn't work out, you can move on. Now, you don't want to jump all the time, but I think it's important to realize sponsors are an incredibly important relationship, and the fit should be a good one. Now, if there's a shortage, I'm not sure what to say about that. I think just to reach out to other people, there may be other ways. I'm not sure. Scott, what do you suggest? I'm drawing a blank on that one.
First of all, SPA is a much newer program, so there are going to be not as many people with long-term sobrieties, and a lot of time the best sponsors are people with long-term sobriety. So there may be a shortage of qualified sponsors. In his share, he needs to say, I'm really looking for a sponsor. If anybody's willing to even be a temporary sponsor, please, poke me after the meeting or something, and I'll come and talk to you, and we'll see if it's a fit. It's hard to find a sponsor. In AA, where there's a lot, it's a much bigger fellowship. There are more people with lots of time. It's fairly easy to find a sponsor.
Right.
In the S programs, it's harder. And I mean, at one point I was doing like 6 or 7 people, and I've had to pare that way down because of work. And, I don't want to cross any boundaries and things like that. As a matter of fact, the 2 sponsees I have left are, we practically sponsor each other at this point. It's been so long. But, they're more friends than sponsees at this point. But, I make them sponsor people. So,
There you go.
But, it's tough. It can be tough to find a sponsor. And I think the big thing is everybody, 2 issues hold us back. Number one, I'm afraid of being rejected, so I just don't ask anybody. And number 2, I'm looking for the perfect person. Well, what if they're to this or to that, or not enough this or not enough? Yeah, okay, come on. The sponsor's job is to walk you through the 12 steps. And, if you have a question, to answer it. They're not going to micromanage your life, or they shouldn't anyway, in my opinion.
Right.
Some of them try.
And I would add, in this particular case, where the guy sounds like he has a struggle reaching out in general, I think I would really practice reaching out to other people, not even just with the intention of getting a sponsor, but just to make connection. Because the more we practice that, I was that way too. I was really afraid to even raise my hand and share for a couple of months, and I'm just really afraid to reach out and say hello even. So But it was very good for me just to start introducing myself and just break the ice and do it. And it made it much easier to find sponsors and friends down the road if I could just be more.
Yeah, if the group ever goes to fellowship after the meeting, which means dinner or coffee or anything, that's where I started to get to know people and
Totally.
found my support network was going out after meetings to a terrible Chinese restaurant that we always went to. It's closed now, thank God. It was a buffet. It was so greasy. But there would be 10 or 12 people sitting around a table eating greasy Chinese food and laughing. And, you know, I found my tribe out of that group. And, you know, we've collected more over the years. And, you know, now I have a great support network. It didn't happen overnight. And it was very uncomfortable for me to go out to fellowship. I just sat there like the least sociable person in the world and, you know, ate my chow mein while everybody else had a good time, but they kept inviting me, you know, God bless them. So again, I kept going and eventually, you know, I loosened up and made some great connections there. But it does take some energy, and, you know, the phone weighs 1,000 pounds in early recovery. It is so hard to pick up the phone. It's hard to pick up the phone when I'm feeling good, let alone when I'm on the brink of acting out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anything you want to say to take us out, David?
Yeah, just great topic, great questions. Thanks, everybody. And just this empathy notion is a really critical piece of it. So we need to keep practicing, keep learning, for sure.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen overnight. You have to practice it, and you will do it imperfectly. I'm talking to the addicts. You know, here you have to try, and you'll make some mistakes, and you have to say, I think you might be feeling this. Is this what you're feeling? And then your partner will go, no, actually, I'm feeling this. And you go, oh, thank you for clarifying.
And you know, I mentioned being curious, Scott, but that's a really good point I hadn't mentioned before. Just check it out. You know, that's where we learn too, because we may be off base, but eventually we get pretty good at it if we check out our intuition.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everybody, thank you. We'll be back next Wednesday, same time, same place. We hope to see you.
Feel better. Ciao.